The Oregon rain had finally stopped, leaving behind a silence broken only by the settling of mud and the distant rhythmic dripping from the canopy of ancient Douglas firs. For Andrew Thorne, the silence was deafening. It was the sound of failure. At 26, Andrew was the youngest chief engineer in the history of New Frontier construction. He had a master's degree from MIT, a mind engineered for algorithmic problem-solving, and a track record of completing projects under budget and ahead of schedule. But the deep woods of the Pacific Northwest did not care about his pedigree. Andrew stood beside his pristine white Land Rover Defender, a stark contrast to the apocalyptic churn of the logging site. The tires of his vehicle were caked in thick, gray clay, but the interior remained a sanctuary of leather and digital screens. Outside, however, the reality of the Blackwood Ridge clearing was a nightmare of physics and frustrated ambition. Before him lay the Hercules Logs. They were a colossal stack of old-growth timber, felled weeks ago before a sudden, catastrophic shift in environmental regulations forced New Frontier to abandon the site. The logs had been piled onto a heavy steel transport sled, intended to be hauled out by the company's fleet of modern computerized machinery. But then the unseasonal rains had come, turning the decommissioned mining road into a bottomless trench of supersaturated loam. The sled had sunk up to its axles, effectively anchoring 50 tons of dense, waterlogged wood to the earth. Andrew stared at his digital tablet, the screen glowing against the overcast sky. The failure logs from the past 3 days were a testament to modern engineering's defeat. On Tuesday, they had hooked up a state-of-the-art Caterpillar D9 dozer. The massive yellow machine, boasting over 400 horsepower and wide, high-traction treads, had roared to life. Its exhaust had belched black smoke into the pristine air as the operator pushed the throttle to the maximum. The massive steel cables had pulled taut, singing with lethal tension, but the logs hadn't moved. Instead, the D9 had simply dug its own grave, its massive tracks spinning helplessly in the soft earth, churning the ground into a soupy slick until the undercarriage rested flat against the mud. On Wednesday, they had tried a tandem pull. 2 D8 dozers, perfectly synchronized via computer-assisted telemetry, attempted to break the static inertia. The result was a snapped high-tensile steel cable that whipped back and nearly decapitated a foreman, followed by a transmission failure in one of the dozers. The sheer deadweight inertia of the waterlogged timber, combined with the suction of the Oregon mud, created a coefficient of friction that Andrew's software insisted was insurmountable with their current equipment footprint. The project manager back in Seattle had been unequivocal during their satellite phone call that morning. "I don't care about the sheer strength of the mud, Andrew. I care about the permit. It expires in 48 hours. If those logs aren't moved to the staging area by Friday, the EPA seals the road, the timber rots in the woods, and New Frontier eats a $3 million loss. Figure it out, or pack your desk." Andrew rubbed his temples, feeling the onset of a stress migraine. He looked at the massive pile of wood. The logs were monstrous, some over 6 feet in diameter, their bark thick and deeply grooved. They looked like the corpses of giants mocking his spreadsheets. He tapped his stylus against his clipboard, mentally reviewing the possibility of flying in a heavy-lift Sikorsky helicopter, only to dismiss it immediately due to the canopy density and the exorbitant cost. "Impossible," Andrew muttered to himself, marking a red X on his digital sitemap. "It's a hard scientific fact. The bearing capacity of this soil simply cannot support the traction required to overcome the static load." He was about to retreat into the climate-controlled cabin of his Land Rover when a sound drifted through the damp air. It was a strange, erratic noise, utterly foreign to a modern construction site. It lacked the smooth, high-pitched whine of a turbo diesel or the deep, vibrating hum of heavy machinery. It was a sharp, percussive popping, spit-spat-bang, spit-spat-bang. Andrew turned, his brow furrowed in confusion. Through the mist lingering on the access road, a shape began to materialize. For a moment, Andrew thought he was hallucinating from sleep deprivation. Lumbering down the muddy track, moving at a speed scarcely faster than a brisk walk, was an antique tractor. It was a skeletal construct of rusted cast iron, devoid of a cabin, a roll cage, or any modern safety features. Its wheels were not rubber tires, but massive steel rims fitted with aggressive, angled iron cleats. A thick plume of blue-gray smoke puffed rhythmically from a vertical exhaust pipe that looked like a rusted stovepipe. But it was the driver that truly made Andrew question his sanity. Perched on a suspended metal seat, gripping a wide, rudimentary steering wheel, was an elderly man. He looked to be in his mid-70s, his face weathered into a map of deep creases. He was remarkably thin, yet he sat with a rigid, dignified posture. Most bizarrely, the man was dressed in a dark navy blue suit. It was an old, slightly ill-fitting three-piece suit, complete with a pale blue shirt and a dark tie. The only concessions to the environment were a pair of heavy leather work boots and a bright yellow plastic hard hat resting precariously on his head. The machine rattled and clanked as it pulled up to the clearing, the iron wheels biting deep into the mud but miraculously not sinking. The old man reached forward, adjusting a lever on the steering column, and the deafening popping slowed to a heavy, labored idle. Andrew stood frozen, his clipboard clutched to his chest. Several of the site workers, burly men in high-visibility gear who had been sitting idly on the tracks of the stuck bulldozers, stood up, exchanging bewildered glances. The old man carefully climbed down from the metal seat. He pulled a pristine white handkerchief from his suit pocket, meticulously wiped a smudge of grease from his hands, and tucked it back away. He looked around the site, his sharp gray eyes taking in the sunk caterpillar, the snapped cables, and finally the colossal stack of Hercules Logs. He walked toward Andrew, his boots squelching softly in the mud. Despite the absurdity of his attire, there was an undeniable air of authority about him. "Morning," the old man said. His voice was gravelly, carrying the dry cadence of a lifelong local. "Name's Elias Jones, though around the ridge they usually just call me Rust Bucket." Andrew blinked, trying to assemble a professional response. "Andrew Thorne, Chief Engineer for New Frontier. Mr. Jones, this is an active, restricted industrial site. If you're lost, or if you're looking for the Historical Society's weekend fair, the highway is about 12 miles back that way." Elias chuckled, a dry, raspy sound. He didn't look toward the highway. He kept his eyes locked on the pile of timber. "I ain't lost, son. I live on the adjacent acreage over the ridge. Heard your boys making a whole lot of noise the past few days. Sounded like a dying dinosaur over here. Figured I'd wander over and see what all the fuss was about." Andrew sighed, his patience already stretched, paper thin. "The fuss, Mr. Jones, is a 50-ton logistical failure. We are dealing with an impossible load scenario. The soil saturation has compromised our traction parameters. Now, I really must ask you to leave the perimeter for your own safety." Elias ignored the dismissal. He walked past Andrew, stepping remarkably lightly over the deep ruts left by the bulldozers. He approached the enormous sled, running a gloved hand over the thick steel runners. He looked at the mud, then at the massive treads of the stuck D9. "You're trying to outrun the weight," Elias said quietly. "Excuse me?" Andrew asked, stepping forward. "I moved bigger piles of redwood with my father before you were a glint in your mother's eye, Mr. Thorne," Elias said, turning back to face the young engineer. "That stack right there, it's heavy, sure. 50 tons is a fair guess, but your fancy yellow machines over there, they can't move it because they're designed for the wrong kind of fight. They're designed for power and speed. They spin too fast. They hit the mud, they break the surface tension, and they dig themselves a grave." Andrew let out a short, incredulous laugh. He looked at Elias, then at the rusting, sputtering relic idling on the road. "And let me guess, you think you can move it?" Elias nodded slowly. "My tractor can pull it." The surrounding workers, who had been listening to the exchange, erupted into laughter. Even Andrew couldn't help but smile a tight, patronizing smile. "Mr. Jones," Andrew said, adopting the tone of a professor speaking to a slow freshman. "That machine is... what? A museum piece?" 1928 Fordson Model F, Elias replied proudly, patting the rusted iron fender. "Runs on kerosene. Hasn't failed me in 50 years. "Right. A 1928 Fordson." Andrew raised his digital tablet, swiping to bring up a blank calculation sheet. "Let's talk physics, Elias. Do you know how much horsepower that tractor has?" 20, Elias said instantly. "On a good day, with clean fuel." Andrew held up his hands toward the sunken caterpillar. "That D9 has over 400 horsepower. It weighs 100,000 pounds. It is entirely computer-managed to optimize track spin, and it failed. This pile of logs is 50 tons of dead weight. The static coefficient of friction in this specific clay composite requires a drawbar pull of roughly 80,000 pounds just to break static inertia. Your antique is numerically, scientifically, and physically incapable of generating the kinetic energy required to move that sled a single inch." Elias listened patiently, not a flicker of doubt crossing his weathered face. He reached up and adjusted his yellow hard hat. "You put a lot of faith in that glowing piece of glass, son." "I put my faith in mathematics," Andrew corrected sharply, his frustration returning. "Mathematics and modern engineering. Impossible is not an opinion, Elias. In this case, it is a hard scientific fact." Elias walked back toward his Fordson. He placed a hand on the vibrating iron wheel. Math is a fine thing. I respect it, but math assumes the world operates in a vacuum. It assumes that more power is always the answer. You're talking about horsepower. Horsepower is how fast you can hit a wall. Torque, Mr. Thorne, is how far you can take that wall with you. Andrew crossed his arms. Torque requires traction. You have narrow iron wheels. You'll sink faster than my bulldozers. No, I won't, Elias countered, his voice rising slightly, carrying a sudden, fierce intensity. Because I'm not floating on rubber treads. These iron cleats don't compress the mud, they slice through it. They bite down past the soup and find the bedrock underneath. And the gearing? You boys build machines to go fast. This Fordson is geared so low, the worm drive creates a reduction ratio you wouldn't believe. It doesn't yank. It doesn't spin. It applies a continuous, unbroken transfer of rotational force, a slow, agonizing crawl that never breaks traction. The crew had gone silent now. The old man's conviction was unnerving. He spoke about the rusted machine with a reverence usually reserved for religious artifacts. Andrew felt a flush of anger. He was a professional. He was the chief engineer. He was not going to be lectured on mechanical physics by an old farmer in a dirty suit. Andrew unclipped a physical piece of paper from his clipboard, a formal incident report form. He pulled a pen from his breast pocket. All right, Elias, you want to play the hero? Fine. I have a crew here costing me $500 an hour to stand around and watch the mud dry. I have a permit that is practically expiring as we speak. Andrew began writing furiously on the paper in bold, capitalized letters. What are you doing? Elias asked. I am officially documenting a failed approach, Andrew said, holding up the clipboard. Written across the top in thick black ink were the words, impossible load, failed approach. I'll make you a wager, old man, Andrew said, his voice hard. You hook your museum piece up to that sled. If you move it, and I mean actually transport it out of this trench, not just rock it an inch, I will personally rewrite the logistical manuals for this company. I will integrate your old-school torque theories into the design of our next difficult site. I'll hire you as a consultant. Elias's eyes narrowed. And if I don't? If you fail, Andrew said, pointing the pen at him, if you snap an axle, or dig yourself into a hole, or hold up my extraction team for another second, you pay for the fuel my generators are burning while we watch this circus act, and you leave my site immediately. Elias looked at the arrogant young engineer, then at the massive pile of logs, and finally at his sputtering Fordson. A slow, quiet smile spread across his face. Deal, Elias said. Before Andrew could say another word, Elias turned to the back of his tractor. He unlatched a heavy iron toolbox and began wrestling with something inside. The site workers watched in breathless silence as the old man, his suit jacket straining against his surprisingly broad shoulders, dragged out a length of chain. Andrew's breath caught in his throat. It wasn't the high-tensile, braided steel cable New Frontier used. It was an incredibly thick, rusted iron logging chain. Each link was the size of a man's fist, forged decades ago by heavy hammers and intense heat. It looked like something used to anchor a battleship. Elias dragged the heavy chain through the mud, his dress boots sinking deep, though he didn't seem to notice. He waded into the muck up to his shins, reaching under the massive steel sled holding the Hercules Logs. With a grunt of effort, he looped the heavy iron chain around the primary towing bollard, securing it with a massive clevis pin. He then dragged the other end of the chain back to the Fordson, dropping it over the solid steel drawbar at the rear of the tractor. There were no hydraulic winches, no computerized tension release valves. It was a direct, brutal connection between 20 horsepower of antique iron and 50 tons of dead weight. Andrew stood by the front of his Land Rover. He raised his hand, resting his chin between his thumb and index finger, a posture of extreme skepticism. He held his clipboard under his left arm. He was ready to stop the old man the moment the tractor began to smoke or the chain threatened to snap under the laws of physics. Elias climbed back into the metal seat. He adjusted his yellow hard hat, ensuring it sat perfectly straight. He reached down and adjusted the throttle lever. The spit-spat bang of the exhaust deepened, growing louder, more rhythmic. A thick plume of black smoke shot up into the gray Oregon sky. The old man looked back over his shoulder, checking the tension on the heavy iron chain. Then he looked forward, his hands gripping the iron steering wheel. He didn't look at Andrew. He didn't look at the laughing crew. He only looked at the road ahead. Slowly, deliberately, Elias's foot began to release the heavy iron clutch pedal. The silence that fell over the Blackwood Ridge clearing was absolute, save for the rhythmic, concussive popping of the 1928 Fordson. The thick gray mist seemed to hang suspended, caught in the gravity of the moment. Around the perimeter, a dozen veteran loggers and heavy machinery operators stood perfectly still, their eyes darting between the frail-looking old man in the yellow hard hat and the colossal, mud-swallowed sled of redwood timber. Andrew Thorne stood rigid by the front fender of his Land Rover, his knuckles white as he gripped his clipboard. His mind, usually a sanctuary of clean algorithms and predictable outcomes, was running a frantic diagnostic. The drawbar pull equation was simple. The mass of the sled, multiplied by the coefficient of friction of the saturated loam, meant that the 50-ton load required an immense, explosive horizontal force to break its static inertia. A 20-horsepower four-cylinder kerosene engine produced a fraction of that required energy. It was a mathematical certainty. The tractor would either stall, snap its drive chain, or simply rear up and flip backward, crushing the old man in his absurd three-piece suit. Elias Jones did not look like a man facing the impossible. He looked like a man settling into a familiar armchair. With his left hand resting lightly on the iron steering wheel, Elias's right foot began to ease off the heavy cast-iron clutch pedal. He didn't rev the engine. He didn't attempt to shock the load. He simply let the mechanical connection engage. The popping of the Fordson's exhaust abruptly changed pitch, deepening into a guttural, labored chug. A thick plume of soot-black smoke erupted from the vertical pipe, staining the damp Oregon air. The massive iron logging chain, draped limply through the mud, suddenly snapped taut. It rose from the muck, shedding thick clumps of clay, until it became a rigid, vibrating line of solid iron connecting the rear of the antique tractor to the buried steel sled. Andrew braced himself. Here it comes, he thought. The stall. The tractor's engine bogged down. The RPMs dropped so low that Andrew could hear the individual detonations within the cylinders. Chug, chug, chug. It sounded as though the engine was drawing its final, agonizing breaths. But it did not die. Instead, the mechanical governor kicked in, opening the throttle valve wider to compensate for the massive load. The engine fought back, a raw mechanical defiance that sent a visible shudder through the tractor's iron chassis. The wide, cleated iron wheels of the Fordson began to turn. They did not spin in a blur of wasted energy like the massive rubber tracks of the Caterpillar D9 had. They rotated with agonizing slowness, biting into the earth. The angled iron cleats sheared through the soupy topsoil, pressing down past the saturated clay until they found the densely packed hardpan beneath. "He's digging in," murmured one of the foremen standing a few yards from Andrew. "He's gonna bury it." But Elias wasn't burying the machine. As the iron wheels dug down, the chassis of the Fordson lowered, dropping its center of gravity even further. The drawbar, positioned meticulously low on the rear axle, ensured that the immense resistance of the 50-ton load was pulling the tractor down into the dirt, increasing its traction rather than pulling it backward. The chain groaned, a high-pitched, terrifying sound of metal being stretched to its molecular limits. Still, the Hercules Logs did not move. Andrew let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. He glanced down at his clipboard, ready to finalize the failure report. He had been right. Torque was meaningless if it couldn't overcome the static threshold. He looked back up, preparing to wave Elias off before something shattered and someone got killed. "Elias, that's enough!" Andrew shouted over the straining engine. "Cut the throttle before you snap the clevis!" Elias didn't even turn his head. His eyes were locked on the horizon, his jaw set in a grim line beneath the brim of his yellow hard hat. He reached down and adjusted a lever on the steering column, retarding the spark. The engine smoothed out into a low, relentless, thumping rhythm. It wasn't a contest of power anymore. It was a siege. The Fordson's worm gear drive, an ancient and brilliantly simple mechanism, was taking the engine's modest rotational force and multiplying it by an astronomical factor. The tractor was geared so low that, at full throttle in first gear, its top speed was scarcely a mile an hour. Every ounce of explosive energy from the kerosene was being converted into pure, unadulterated, twisting force. Crack! The sound was sharp, like a rifle shot echoing through the dense timber. Andrew flinched, expecting to see the heavy iron chain whip back through the air. But the chain was intact, stretched so tight it looked like a solid steel rod. The sound hadn't come from the rigging. It had come from the earth. Andrew stepped away from his Land Rover, his eyes wide, tracking the sound. He looked at the massive steel runners of the sled, buried deep in the mud. Crack, groan. The mud surrounding the front of the sled was beginning to fracture. Tiny spiderweb fissures appeared in the gray clay. The static friction, the invisible, unbreakable wall of physics that had defeated 400 horsepower of computerized machinery, was beginning to yield. It was imperceptible at first, a trick of the misty light. But then Andrew saw it. The massive bollard on the front of the sled, the attachment point for the chain, shifted forward. It was a movement measured in millimeters, but it moved. Andrew's breath caught in his throat. He looked at the Fordson. The tractor was still crawling, its iron wheels making a quarter rotation every few seconds, the engine thumping with a rhythmic, unstoppable heartbeat. Then the sled groaned again, a deep, resonant sound of ancient wood and heavy steel protesting against the earth. And it began to slide. It was an impossible sight. The 50-ton mountain of waterlogged redwood, the Hercules Logs that had broken modern high-tensile cables and humiliated the finest engineering equipment New Frontier construction possessed, was being dragged through the mud by a machine built before the Great Depression. It did not lurch forward. It did not surge. It flowed. The sled carved through the mud like a glacial ice shelf, pushing a massive bow wave of gray sludge ahead of it. The Fordson didn't waver. Elias sat atop the vibrating iron beast, his posture rigid, his hands lightly guiding the wheel. He looked entirely serene, a captain navigating a slow, inevitable tide. Andrew stood frozen, the heavy plastic clipboard slipping from his slackened grip and landing in the mud with a soft smack. He didn't notice. His mouth was slightly agape, his brow furrowed in a profound existential shock. He was staring at a living paradox. He was a man who had dedicated his life to the religion of numbers, of calculated limits and absolute certainties. And right before his eyes, a 74-year-old man in a dusty suit was rewriting his sacred texts with a tank of kerosene and a rusted gear set. "I don't believe it," Andrew whispered, the words lost to the thumping of the engine. "Holy hell," the foreman beside him breathed, taking off his hard hat and wiping his forehead. "He's actually pulling it. The crazy old bastard is actually pulling it." The procession was agonizingly slow. The distance to the solid gravel of the staging area was only 200 yards, but at the Fordson's crawl, it felt like miles. For nearly an hour, the clearing was suspended in a state of hypnotic tension. The engine thudded, the thick black smoke plumed. The iron cleats bit and released the earth, and the colossal sled of timber dragged relentlessly forward, inch by grueling inch. Andrew followed alongside, his expensive leather boots sinking into the mud, his eyes locked on the taut iron chain. He was watching the physics happen in real time, his mind desperately reverse-engineering the impossible. It's the continuous tension, Andrew realized, a sudden spark of understanding illuminating his shock. The bulldozers failed because they hit the load with an initial shockwave of kinetic energy, breaking their own traction before the load could move. The Fordson isn't shocking the load, it's applying a continuous, unbreakable curve of torque. It's treating the 50 tons not as an obstacle to be smashed, but as a partner in a slow, mechanical dance. As the Fordson finally reached the transition point where the soft mud met the hard-packed gravel of the staging area, the engine note changed. The resistance dropped and the tractor surged forward a few inches, pulling the sled up onto the solid ground with a deafening scrape of steel on rock. Elias depressed the heavy clutch and pulled back on the throttle. The tractor rolled to a gentle stop, the engine settling back into its erratic, spitting idle. The sudden cessation of the deep, grinding noise left the clearing feeling hollow. For a long moment, nobody moved. The crew simply stared at the massive stack of redwoods now resting securely on the staging ground. Then, a slow, scattered applause broke out among the loggers and operators. It swelled into cheers and whistles, the men shaking their heads in disbelief at the rusted machine and its stoic driver. Elias reached over and twisted a valve, cutting off the kerosene supply. The engine gave one final violent shudder and died, leaving only the sound of hissing steam from the radiator and the ticking of cooling iron. Slowly, Elias climbed down from the metal seat. He looked exhausted. The deep lines in his face were accentuated by soot and a sheen of sweat. He pulled the white handkerchief from his suit pocket and carefully wiped his brow, leaving a smear of grease across the pristine fabric. Andrew walked toward him. He felt stripped bare, his arrogance washed away by the sheer, undeniable reality of what had just occurred. He stooped down, picking up his mud-stained clipboard along the way. The old man turned to face him, leaning heavily against the enormous iron rear wheel of his tractor. He didn't gloat. He didn't smile. He just looked at the young engineer with tired, knowing eyes. "Well, Mr. Thorne," Elias said, his voice raspy. "Looks like my math held up." Andrew looked past Elias, staring at the Hercules Logs. A massive mobile weighing bridge, set up by the EPA compliance officers, was stationed at the edge of the gravel pad. The foremen were already hooking up a modern wheel loader to push the sled the final few feet onto the scales. "Let's see what it weighs," Andrew said quietly, his voice lacking any of its former sharp authority. Elias nodded, and the two men walked side by side toward the scales. The crew secured the sled onto the heavy steel plates. The digital readout on the side of the weighing station flickered, calculating the mass. The red LED numbers stabilized, 104,320 lbs, 52 tons. It was heavier than Andrew's worst-case scenario estimates. It was a load that, by every metric of modern heavy machinery design on that specific soil composite, was officially, unequivocally immovable. Andrew stared at the red numbers for a long time. Then he looked down at the clipboard in his hands. He stared at the bold, capitalized letters he had written barely an hour ago. Impossible load. Failed approach. He unclipped the incident report. With slow, deliberate movements, Andrew ripped the thick paper in half, then in half again. He let the pieces fall from his hands, watching them flutter down to be swallowed by the muddy gravel. He turned to Elias. The old man was watching him, a faint glimmer of amusement now dancing in his sharp gray eyes. "I was wrong," Andrew said, his voice loud enough for the surrounding crew to hear. The words tasted like ash, but they felt necessary. "My algorithms said no. My physics model said no. And I trusted the model more than I trusted the reality of the ground." Elias adjusted his yellow hard hat. "Models are drawn by men in clean rooms, son. Dirt doesn't read blueprints." "The machine wasn't the problem," Andrew continued, gesturing back toward the sunken, useless caterpillar bulldozers. "They have the power, but we lacked the understanding of how to apply it. We were fighting the inertia instead of leaning into it. Your torque, your leverage, it bypassed the failure points of our modern treads entirely." "Old iron," Elias said, patting the pocket of his suit. "Built back when a man had to feel the earth he was working, not just look at it on a screen. You can't code a computer to understand patience, Mr. Thorne." Andrew extended his hand. "Andrew," he corrected quietly. Elias looked at the young man's clean, manicured hand, then reached out with his own, calloused and stained with grease. Their handshake was firm, a bridge between two vastly different eras of engineering. "You made a wager, Andrew," Elias said, a dry smile finally cracking his weathered face. "I believe you mentioned something about rewriting manuals." "I did," Andrew said, the ghost of a smile touching his own lips. The crushing weight of the impending deadline was gone, replaced by a profound, humbling awe. "And I meant it. We have a contract in the Cascades starting next month. The ground pressure requirements are a nightmare. My digital models say we can't use our heavy equipment without destroying the watershed." Andrew gestured to the battered, smoking 1928 Fordson. "I want to hire you, Elias, you and your tractor, as a site consultant for low-impact leverage extraction. I need you to teach my team how to pull without tearing the earth apart." Elias looked back at his machine, then out toward the misty tree line. "Consultant, huh? Does that mean I have to wear a tie?" "You're already wearing one," Andrew pointed out. "This is my formal logging attire," Elias deadpanned. "For consulting, I might have to break out the tuxedo." Andrew laughed, a genuine relieved sound that echoed across the clearing. The tension that had choked the site for 3 days completely evaporated. The crew began moving with renewed energy, securing the logs for final transport, their morale entirely restored by the miraculous spectacle. Later that afternoon, after the EPA inspectors had signed off on the extraction and the massive sled was hooked up to a paved road semi-truck, Andrew stood by his Land Rover preparing to leave the site. He pulled out his tablet. He opened the digital site map, deleted the red X he had placed over the Hercules Logs, and marked the extraction as complete. Then he opened a new blank document. He titled it Leverage Dynamics and Continuous Torque Application, a reevaluation of static friction overcoming in saturated loam. He paused, his stylus hovering over the screen. He looked up, watching Elias Jones slowly trundle back down the muddy access road on his rusted Fordson, the loud spit-spat-bang echoing through the ancient firs, a thick plume of black smoke trailing behind him like a banner of victory. Andrew smiled, deleted the technical title, and typed a new one. The Torque That Taught Us to Relearn.